Okay, Assalamu alaikum and welcome back. We will inshallah be tackling another couple of important topics in this lecture. And I know I'm going to start losing credibility here because every lecture I seem to be saying this is a really important lecture, but this is a really important lecture. And it's a lecture about material that hardly ever gets discussed in modern Islamic discourse, but is really critical to Hadith application. So our first topic will be understanding Hadith in light of different social conditions. And this is an extremely important issue, and it is often quite neglected when it comes to assessing how to apply a Hadith. Now, by its very nature, it involves the use of reason to make judgments, and once again underscores and emphasizes the flexibility of the Islamic law and the enlightened and non-dogmatic approach which our best scholars take. Now, in his book, كيف نتعامل مع السنة النبوية, how we should deal with the prophetic sunnah, the great modern scholar Yusuf al-Qaradawi has a section entitled Explicit Rulings Based on Conditions Which Have Changed. In this section, he discusses the need to assess the precise circumstances in which a prophetic ruling was revealed, with the notion that the intent of the ruling, rather than the letter of the rule, be the guiding principle in juristic rulemaking. So he offers an example of the limits which the Prophet, peace be upon him, set on the eligibility to pay zakah. In other words, the degree of wealth needed to make someone responsible for paying zakah, and the poverty line below which the obligation of zakah drops. Now, the Prophet had specified that this should be either 200 dirhams of silver or 20 dinars of gold. At that time, the conversion rate was 10 dirhams silver per dinar of gold. Since then, silver has diminished in value vis-a-vis gold, and so what was a consistent standard set by the Prophet would no longer be consistent today. So Sheikh al-Qaradawi therefore advocates that the standard be made uniform despite an explicit prophetic announcement detailing the limits for zakah. This is because Sheikh al-Qaradawi understands that there's nothing sacred about the amount 200 dirham. What is sacred, rather, is that there's a system of social welfare wherein those who have been blessed with more help those who have been given less. So, Sheikh al-Qaradawi states, quote, and I have shown in my book Fiqh al-Zakah, the jurisprudence of zakah, that the Prophet, peace be upon him, did not mean to put two discrepant standards for zakah, but rather it is one standard. Whoever possesses it is considered wealthy, such that zakah is incumbent upon him, and it was assessed by two monetary standards which were customarily used in the age of the Prophet, and so the explicit rule came based upon this existing system and set the standard according to equivalent monetary units in both systems. So if the situation has changed in our time and the value of silver has drastically diminished vis-a-vis the value of gold, we cannot continue to use the same standard and thus set a system which is markedly discrepant in the two monetary units. And the reference from Sheikh al-Qaradawi's book is given in your syllabus. Now, another example that's less esoteric is the practice of ramal, or jogging in tawaf during pilgrimage, which the Prophet did and asked Muslims to do, and if you go to pilgrimage, you will see the pilgrims doing this. And the scholars have taken this as a sunnah for Hajj, but the companion Ibn Abbas felt that the Prophet did this only for a special circumstance. And this circumstance was that when the Muslims went for their Hajj, the unbelievers of Quraysh were watching the Muslims and saying that they had been weakened by a sickness going on in Medina, and the Prophet wanted to dispel any such notion by having the Muslims show strength and vigor by doing the ramal, or the jogging. Therefore, this practice is not obligatory and really may not even constitute a sunnah of the Prophet to be imitated at large, but was rather an action that had nothing to do with the religion as such, and was circumstantial. It was in response to a very specific circumstance during that pilgrimage. Thus, Umar ibn al-Khattab is reported to have said, what do we have to do with Ramal now? We were trying to show strength before a people that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala destroyed. So what Umar ibn al-Khattab was saying is that the circumstances have changed and we don't need to be doing Ramal now, because by his time, of course, Islam had become predominant in the Arabian Peninsula. So these two examples show that the application of hadiths that were based directly on one set of standards or a set of circumstances which have changed may also change. And that is a very, very important principle. And it lends intellectual vitality to the hadith. Okay, now let's go to another related topic, and it's understanding hadiths in terms of considerations of social welfare. Now, whatever pronouncements the Prophet made were directed at enhancing either the welfare of the individual or of the community. So considerations of social welfare must enter into the interpretation and application of hadith, particularly if the circumstances under which the Prophet made his pronouncements change. And this, of course, is a principle in usul al-fiqh, al-masalih al-mursala, that the general benefits have to always be weighed in to juristic rulings. Now, these concepts were clearly understood by the Prophet's companions, who didn't feel that they were violating a hadith when they altered its applications due to considerations of social welfare. As Yusuf al-Qaradawi described, the companions sometimes quote, and again direct quote, because this is something that if it was said by an ordinary average Muslim might seem very controversial. This is now being said by one of the top scholars of the 20th century, that the companions sometimes, quote, stopped applying the explicit meaning of some hadiths when it became apparent to them that they treated a specific set of circumstances in the age of the Prophet, but those circumstances had since changed from what they were, end quote. So let's look at an example for illustration. It concerns the disposition of land which the Muslims acquired during the early expansion of the Ummah. The Prophet, peace be upon him, set a clear precedent by dividing the lands of Khaybar after the conquest of Khaybar among the military who conquered it. However, during the age of the Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab, radiallahu anhu, he did not divide a portion of Iraq among the Muslims who entered it, keeping it instead with its owners who paid the Ummah a tax. This change in policy, although there was a clear precedent set by the Prophet in a matter of significant importance to the Muslim military, was dictated by considerations of social welfare. The classical commentator Ibn Qudama stated, quote, "The Prophet's division of Khaybar was in the early days of Islam and in a time of great need, and this decision was where society's welfare lay. Thereafter, social welfare lay not in dividing the land, and so such became the requirement." And so you see that even from the classical age, our scholars clearly understood that the requirements of social welfare dictated how the hadith was applied. Now, similar considerations prompted the caliphs Uthman ibn Affan and Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anhuma to alter the Prophet's directive regarding stray cattle. It's recorded that the Prophet had given instructions that if a stray animal was found, that it was to be left alone and allowed to graze until its owner retrieved it. However, in the years following the Prophet's death, social mores deteriorated, such that the stray animals were often taken by whoever found them and added to their herds. In effect, they were stolen. Therefore, in the interest of social welfare, both Uthman and Ali devised different policies which involved the government either housing the cattle or selling the cattle and earmarking the money for the owner if they returned to claim their animals. Two different policies. Now, neither caliph apparently felt any hesitation in departing from the Prophet's directive. They realized that leaving the cattle to graze free or housing them, or selling them were not issues of sin or virtue. Rather, whatever policy secures the rights of the owner with regard to his cattle is the essence of the Prophet's sunnah. And again, the footnote from Sheikh al-Qaradawi's book is in your syllabus for your reference, but the principle is loud and clear, and unfortunately, we really hardly ever hear these sorts of principles being discussed or taught in how to understand and apply and deal with hadith. Okay, now let's tackle one last topic, again, really a critical topic, and that is understanding hadith in terms of the original purpose behind the law. Now, this is similar to the above considerations of social welfare and of changing circumstances, but it's an even more broad consideration. It entails attempting to educe or deduce the original reasons behind a hadith. So, we ask ourselves, why did the Prophet, peace be upon him, say what he said? And if these reasons are social reasons or administrative reasons rather than spiritual, then the hadith is open to reconsideration in terms of application. Notions like this seem to always make Muslims anxious, as there's a feeling that the sunnah of the Prophet is somehow not being given its due, or that somehow people are tampering with the Prophet's legacy for expediency or convenience in the modern age, and that somehow we're watering down the sunnah. However, it's important to realize that this sort of analysis process has been and continues to be a very legitimate part of Islamic jurisprudence. So once again, an illustrative and important example is provided from Sheikh al-Qaradawi's already cited important work in this area. كيف نتعامل مع السنة النبوية? How should we deal with the prophetic sunnah? We take the well-known hadith stating that the woman should not travel except in the company of a mahram. And a mahram is a husband or a first-degree male relative. The text of the hadith is, quote, "It is not lawful for a woman who believes in God and the last day to travel a day's journey except in the company of a mahram." This hadith, related by Abu Huraira, is found in both Sahih Muslim and Sahih al-Bukhari with other similar hadiths. Now, despite its sound chain of transmission and its clear meaning, Sheikh al-Qaradawi does not shy away from looking at its intent, rather than insisting that its sound chain and clear meaning imply a permanent juristic rule. As he states, if we imagine travel conditions at that time, traveling through an uncharted desert, no electric lights on the highway, no highway to begin with, peopled by marauding tribes, it's easy to see that a woman traveling alone may come to physical harm, whereas a woman traveling through many nights in the company of a man who is not a mahram may come to harm in her reputation. He then goes on to say, quote, "However, if the situation has changed, such as in our day, and travel is now via a plane which carries 100 people or more, or via a train which carries hundreds of travelers, and there is no longer fear for a woman if she travels alone, then there is no onus in terms of Sharia upon her if she does this. In other words, there's no problem if she travels alone, and this does not count as contradicting the hadith." This is in Sheikh al-Qaradawi's book, page 129. So clearly, hadiths such as this, when not examined on the basis of intent, can form a corpus or body of rules which lead, for example, to the limitation of women or their marginalization from full participation in society. Now, for our students raised in the West, this whole topic may seem silly, like we're making an issue out of nothing. Believe me, unfortunately, this is not so. For example, there's a modern English language fatwa, religious opinion, on the website islamqa.info from December 8th, 2007, and it's answering question 101520. And in this question, a woman asks, quote, "I know that a woman is not permitted to travel without a mahram with her. I would like to know what is meant by traveling exactly. Where should we start measuring the distance? From the beginning, a place in the desert, or from where? My father has a farm on Misr Ismailiyya Way, and he likes us to visit him every so often. This farm is about 75 minutes maximum from home. Is this considered traveling, considering that there are many new cities, schools, companies, and farms along the way? And that ends her question. Now the answer, possibly a translated fatwa from the Arabic, but it is in English on the website, begins, the Sahih Sunnah indicates that it is not permissible for a woman to travel except with a mahram. This traveling is not defined by a specified distance, as is the case with shortening the prayers or breaking the fast. Rather, everything that is called traveling, whether it is long or short, is not permitted for a woman unless she has a mahram with her. The fatwa then goes on to quote a hadith narrated by Ibn Abbas that the Prophet said, no woman should travel except with a mahram. Therefore, hopefully, you see why the principles we have been studying are so important. Not only are there issues of circumstance and intent revolving around these hadiths as discussed above, but we recall the importance of eliciting all hadiths on a topic. For example, the website just quotes a hadith that says it's not lawful for a woman to travel without a mahram. But the hadith we first mentioned, according to Abu Huraira, does give a distance stipulation. It says a full day's journey, contradicting what the website fatwa said. Therefore, even if we were to accept the ruling as applicable today, which we do not, let's make that very clear, there would be very strong grounds to argue that a short journey, such as the woman was initially asking about, 75 minutes to travel to her father's farm, would certainly be permissible because the hadith of Abu Huraira states a day's journey. And so these principles really are critical. Now let's look at another example. There's a reported hadith of the Prophet which states, quote, whoever cultivates barren land becomes its owner, end quote. And this is reported in the Sunan of Abu Dawud. According to this hadith, if there is unclaimed land, it becomes the lawful property of whoever will cultivate it. Now, during the time of the Prophet, this was a very sensible policy aimed at social welfare. It gave incentive to a small population living in a vast arid desert to cultivate the land and represented a socially progressive and positive policy. This is especially so in that with regard to cultivation, most people would have been relatively equal in means, as the cultivation then simply depended on manpower. Now it's easy to see that in today's world, this hadith could not be reasonably applied. The legal disputes over land ownership would be endless. Also, business tycoons, for example, could arrange to cultivate millions of acres of unclaimed land using the latest agricultural technology in terms of large machines, genetically engineered crops, pesticides, and armies of hired cheap labor. Then they would claim ownership of the land. The chances for poor peasants, meanwhile, to compete for land ownership would be minimal. Clearly, such a policy today fails the reason or logic test, which should check the application of ahad hadiths, and that reason test should be used against whoever would claim the land as their Islamic right based on this hadith of the Prophet. Therefore, those who are using hadith need to be very cognizant of the critical need and importance of a full analysis, one which goes way, way beyond the traditional questions as to whether the hadith has a sound chain of transmission or not. So once again, Sheikh al-Qaradawi expresses these sentiments clearly and succinctly in his brief chapter, As-Sunnah بين اللفظ والروح أو بين الظواهر والمقاصد. So, what does this title mean? As-Sunnah بين اللفظ والروح. It means the Sunnah between its letter and its spirit, أو بين الظواهر والمقاصد, or between the apparent explicit meaning and the intent. And that really is our question. Remember, Sheikh al-Qaradawi is truly one of the leading Islamic scholars of the modern age. And he says, quote, rigidly holding onto the letter of the Sunnah is sometimes not an implementation of the spirit of the Sunnah or its intent, but rather a contradiction of it, even if on the surface it is an apparent adherence to it. Sheikh al-Qaradawi, page 135. So the reader and the student and the listener should now honestly examine what his or her attitude or the attitude of other Muslims they know may be to such statements if they came from a, quote, average Muslim rather than from a renowned scholar like Sheikh al-Qaradawi. It's probably safe to say that unfortunately such statements would be deemed heresy by many, or would be deemed as some sort of modernist or Western attempt to dilute and compromise the Sunnah, and would not even merit serious consideration, despite their very essential place in Hadith scholarship. I sincerely hope that you're now seeing the importance of this material and this approach, and we hope, inshallah, that you are finding it useful and helpful and sensible in your journey to learn more and more about Islam. May God accept from us and may God bless you, inshallah, and we will see you in the next lecture, which I know you're waiting for me to say it, is inshallah going to be a very important lecture. So tune in then, and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.